This is Ake Book and Arts Festival 2021. I'm Joseph Ike, and you're welcome to my book chat with Professor Howard French, the author of Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to Second World War. Professor French, you're welcome.
It's great to be with you, Joseph.
Thank you so much. This is truly amazing book. I'm a history buff, so I love reading books like this that give a lot more information about things that have happened. Of course, well, that's what history is about. The question lingers in my mind, sir. Why did you write this book, and who was your target audience?
Those are two very different questions, so I'm going to take them separately. I wrote the book. Probably the most immediate reason is because it coincided so deeply with my lifetime experience. I come from a background of African America. I have parents on both sides who are African American, whose past is in slavery. I worked throughout my professional career as a journalist before becoming a professor, reporting throughout the Atlantic Basin, meaning twice in West Africa, West and Central Africa, once in Latin America, and of course I come from the United States, and I also worked for many years in the Caribbean, and I speak several European languages. And so all of these things kind of come together in a stew that sort of prompted me to focus on this issue. The audience question is an interesting one for this conversation. I wrote the book. It's being published initially, at least, by publishers in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And of course, I want to have broad audiences in those two parts of the world, in those two countries in particular, because the book was conceived as a part of an effort to challenge the conventional narrative of how we arrived at the present moment, how the modern world was created. And we'll get into what that means in specific. But the book is, because it's a book about the Atlantic world, I have a desire to see the book make its way into the African mind and into African hands and into African conversations, and especially in West African conversations. And I tweeted this morning as I prepared to head out of my house for school that I was having my first class of the semester, and that I was also excited to be having this conversation with the Ake Festival. And because Nigeria, which is home to Ake, is, as I put it, the superpower manqué, or the missing superpower of the Atlantic world at present. Nigeria, of course, has been the source of so much of the diaspora and of the energy that built the United States and the Western Hemisphere. And Nigeria is the population giant of the African continent. But I look to Nigeria in the future to animating so many of the conversations that are raised or topics that are brought up in my book. And so I'm really pleased to begin in my first public event with Ake.
You said something in the introduction of the book. You said it would be unusual for a story that begins in the wrong place to arrive at the right conclusion. That got me hooked right away. Okay, so where is the right place to begin this story? And then, of course, on the cover of the book, we have 1471 as a specific date. Why is that date picked? Why is that era slightly before possibly 1471? And why is 1471 a prominent date for us to begin the story?
A story that begins in the wrong place, being unlikely to arrive at the right conclusions, means, in the context of my work, that the West tells a very set narrative about the way we have arrived at Western preeminence and wealth, and, as many people in the West see it, Western-driven modernity. And the story sort of goes like this, that in the 15th century, things begin to happen in a particular part of Europe, in specific Iberia, which means Spain and Portugal, which leads to navigators setting off from those two places, looking to make connections with Asia. And the connections with Asia are supposed to be sort of their central obsession and their long-term preoccupation. And so the story gets told about how in the 1400s, Spanish and Portuguese people end up looking for Asia because Asia's great civilizations and fabled wealth, trying to reach Asia by sea, and cutting out the early decades of the 15th century from the story, and in doing so, completely omitting the foundational role that Africa played in the history of Europe kind of reaching out and making contact with the rest of the world and ultimately exploiting much of the rest of the world. Africa is really the start of that story. And so this leads to the second question, why 1471? In the early decades of the 1500s, there was, in the Aviz kingdom of Portugal, Portugal then at the time being a very young kingdom, Portugal had only been founded a little more than 100 years prior to this time. Portugal, young, poor, fragile, and coveted by Spain. In other words, Castile, which was the big kingdom of Spain, not wanting Portugal to survive, wanting to reabsorb Portugal. The Portuguese had a preoccupation with their own security. They needed to find a source of wealth that would fund their existence. And so Portugal, being on the western side of Iberia, cut off from the Mediterranean by Spain, couldn't rely on the standard Mediterranean trade that so much of Southern Europe profited from with the Arab or Middle Eastern world. And so the Portuguese, under this Aviz kingdom, begin to explore for other sources of wealth. And contrary to the traditional narrative, which says that they were determined to find Asia, they were in fact, in the 1430s, determined to find sources of wealth in West Africa. And the most important source of wealth that we're speaking of here is depicted on the very cover of my book. In Sudanic Africa, meaning the Sahel of West Africa, where there was a kingdom at the time called the Mali Empire, which controlled over a tenth of the known supply of gold in the world. And the Portuguese knew this because in the previous century, the ruler of Mali, who is depicted on the cover of the book, a man named Mansa Musa, had made a pilgrimage to Cairo and to Mecca, in which he carried many tons of gold, which he distributed as gifts and tribute and patronage all along the way, and in specific in Cairo and in Mecca. And the amount of gold that Mansa Musa distributed was so enormous that it depressed the value of gold throughout the Mediterranean world and into Europe for at least the next decade. And maps begin to be made that take note of the existence of a kingdom in West Africa called Mali, and in fact of the name of the ruler, Mansa Musa. And this sets the Portuguese, who were desperate to find material basis for their survival against a covetous Spain, to try to find Mali, to try to find the source of Malian gold. And so the Portuguese, beginning in the 1430s, the crown funds exploration missions, which go further and further down the coast of West Africa, until in 1471, they arrive at the place we now know as modern-day Ghana, and they discover immediately upon arrival in Ghana the existence of peoples who are wearing, by the standards of the Portuguese, large amounts of gold on their bodies. Ordinary people walking around with lots of gold on their bodies. And so the Portuguese immediately attribute great significance to this and say, we must have found it. And so to make the story that I explain at some length in my book short, over the next couple of years, the Portuguese build a fort at this site, which is now known in Ghana as Elmina Castle, which was built to secure the gold trade with the local inhabitants of that region. And this is what changes the entire course of Atlantic history, of European history, of West African history, and of, in fact, world history. Because the Portuguese begin to make great amounts of money from the gold trade. This allows them to fund further exploration, meaning eventually, in fact, to Asia, but also throughout Africa before that. They established contact with territories that are in modern-day Nigeria, including Benin, with Congo. They colonize Sao Tome, and eventually they make it into the Indian Ocean and come back up the coast of East Africa. But other important things begin to happen. The Spanish, who, again, wanted to take over Portugal, see how rich and successful the Portuguese are becoming due to African gold. And so the Spanish first tried to seize the gold trade from the Portuguese. They launch a war, a naval war against Portugal in the seas off of Ghana. And the Portuguese somehow win this war. And so the Spanish then say, well, we couldn't snatch this away from the Portuguese. We better do something else on our own to be able to catch up with them. And this is why, in fact, the Spanish begin to fund the explorations of Christopher Columbus, which end up leading to the discovery, quote unquote, of the New World, of the Americas. And so where does this story begin? I don't know how this history is taught in Nigeria or in West Africa, but we in the United States, and I'm pretty certain in most of the Western world, are taught this story that cuts Africa entirely out of the picture. That the Europeans wanted to find Asia, that the big challenge was finding their way simply around Africa, that they had no inherent interest in Africa, and that once they found Asia, all of these incredible things begin to happen, and around the same time, by accident, they discover the Americas, when in fact, it was the establishment of relations and trade for gold in Ghana which set all of these things into motion.
Wow. Now, we do learn, I've learned the history of the New World, the discovery of the New World, and how sugar really essentially was the engine that powered the change in the relationship between Europe and Africa and this New World. How did sugar come into this mix? And you touch on this in your story, but I'd like to hear you just elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, you asked two separate questions here. The first of them is about the shift from trying to capture slaves or trying to grab things from Africa, and shift to a kind of more diplomatic political relationship with different parts of Africa. This all takes place in the 15th century. So as the Portuguese set out in the 1430s and in succeeding decades down the coast of West Africa looking for sources of gold, they were not finding much gold at first. And Portugal was a really weak and poor kingdom, and sending these missions off into the remote corners of Africa was expensive for Portugal. And so Prince Henry of the Aviz dynasty, who was in charge of these expeditions, justified their expense and financed their continuation in the early part of this experience, meaning the 1430s, 1440s, 1450s, by taking slaves from Africa and selling them, not in the Americas, which was not discovered yet, but in Europe. And so initially this consisted of sort of smash and grab, meaning the Portuguese would come off of their ships, they would surprise unfortunate villagers in some part of West Africa, anywhere from Senegal to Guinea-Bissau to Liberia to Sierra Leone, those general area, and they would force them aboard their ships and take them back to Portugal for sale. And the Portuguese quickly found that there was a very lively market for African slavery in Europe at the time. By the way, so the first big surprise of my book is that the story of the beginning of the age of exploration and of modernity is never really told in the conventional accounts at the beginning, which is in Africa, as I've just explained. But they also skip the fact that there was this very early European interest in selling and using slaves from Africa in Europe. So in those decades that I've just highlighted, the 1430s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and beyond, the slave trade was so voluminous in Europe that major European cities like Lisbon and Seville in Spain, Lisbon in Portugal, Seville in Spain, had populations that consisted of as much as 10% slaves, 10% West Africans. Most Europeans today have no idea of that, and there's actually little trace of, genetically speaking, of those populations in the population of Western Europe or Spain and Portugal. And that raises really interesting questions about how these people were put to labor and how they were kept separate from the rest of the population, how they were exploited, and under what sort of conditions of inhumanity that they were exploited. Anyway, to get to your specific question about the shift toward diplomacy, this raiding approach to gathering slaves was itself quite costly. The Europeans did not have very great military superiority over the better organized West African states. In other words, West Africa, as my audience will know, is even today a very varied place. You can't make easy general statements about that are going to give you a keen sense of all of West Africa. So West Africa in the 15th century consisted of some regions which were dominated by highly centralized, really well-organized states, and other regions which were not at all, right? And so when the Portuguese came into contact with areas that were not dominated by centralized states, they discovered that word of mouth itself was enough for the Africans to sort of know what was going on. Hey, there's some kind of strange ship with white people aboard trying to kidnap people in our area. And so the locals would abandon their fields and head inland. And if the Portuguese tried to pursue them, this became very difficult. You know, the Portuguese, in a direct physical confrontation with West Africans, were almost as likely to be killed as they were likely to prevail. And so this is costly. When the Portuguese, on the other hand, arrive in contact with very well constituted kingdoms, as they did in places like Senegal early on, and as they later did in various other places, in Ghana, where they discovered gold, in Benin, of course, in Congo, and in other places, there was no question that they were going to fight these people for their wealth. The West Africans could mass armies that were vastly larger and more capable than any force that the Portuguese could project. And so this is what drives the shift toward diplomacy. The Portuguese came to understand reasonably quickly that we can get more slaves by selling things to the local kingdoms that they desire, and we can talk in detail about what sorts of things those might have been, than we could by trying to impose ourselves upon these people and capture them through violence. And so just to sort of buckle that idea, what they were selling in exchange for slaves in these middle decades of the 15th century were textiles from Europe sometimes, but also and especially metal goods, meaning bronze and iron. And so one of the very popular items along the West African coast back then were bronze basins that you could, for example, put a baby in and wash your child. Iron was sold in bars. And so the West Africans, in many places in the 15th century, had very good ironworking techniques of their own, quite advanced as any in Europe in some places, for example, again, like Benin. But for some of these cultures, iron was in scarce supply. And so the Europeans are coming with iron and coming with bronze objects and the like. And this was, avidly sought out by these West African populations. So trade is established on that basis. To your second question about sugar, the rise of sugar in the Atlantic world doesn't happen until some time later. So gold trade starts in 1471. The Portuguese arrive at this place called Elmina. They discover the locals wearing abundant gold on their bodies. They establish a pact with the local chief in which they're allowed to build a fort. And suddenly they are sending huge amounts of gold back to Europe every year. Okay, so this is the sealing the deal, of this original, the beginnings of our story. Why did the Portuguese and then the Spanish go out into the rest of the world and work so hard toward this idea of exploration? It starts there. However, right after they discovered Elmina, the Portuguese, as they continued further down the coast, and by the way, they didn't, the simplest way of refuting the Asia theory is that the Portuguese discovered Fort Elmina and its gold in 1471. It wasn't until 1488 that the Portuguese tried to sail through Asia. In other words, if Portuguese were so obsessed with Asia, how does one explain why from 1471 to 1488 they didn't try to get to Asia by sea? They had already made the breakthrough to West Africa. And the answer is they had their hands filled and were so busy gaining wealth in West Africa that diverting their attention to some other part of the world hardly made sense. Okay, so right after they discover the gold in Ghana, at that time they think there's going to be gold everywhere they look in Africa. And so they start looking in other places. And they head further down the coast, past Benin, past eastern Nigeria, and they're in the sort of Gulf of Guinea, the eastern stretches of the Gulf of Guinea, just where the African coast starts to descend southward. And they discover the island of Sao Tome, which is uninhabited. There's no one living on Sao Tome. The Sao Tome they discovered is this volcanic place with abundant seasonal rains and really, really rich soil. And the Portuguese get the idea quickly to try to grow sugar there. And they had been growing sugar, which was a rare commodity, very expensive commodity in Europe at the time. Most Europeans lived and died, born and died, never having tasted white sugar in their whole lives back in that era. Only royals could afford to buy sugar. And so the Portuguese had begun growing sugar a decade or two prior to discovering Sao Tome in places like Madeira, much further to the north in the Atlantic Ocean, or the Canary Islands. And they'd figure out that Sao Tome is almost the perfect place in terms of the environment to grow sugar. And so they start growing sugar in Sao Tome, and it explodes. It just takes off. They're buying slaves from nearby coastal areas. Initially, they were buying slaves from Benin. After a brief period of trade in slaves, the Benin kingdom decided it did not want to sell slaves to the Portuguese anymore. And the Portuguese begin to buy slaves from Congo and put them to work on Sao Tome growing sugar. And the Portuguese realized an enormous amount of wealth in a very brief period of time, selling this new commodity onward into Europe. In 1501, the Portuguese discover, quote unquote, Brazil. I have to say quote unquote because, of course, all of the New World, so to speak, was already inhabited, as was Brazil by its own native population. 1501, the Portuguese discover Brazil, and Brazil, by accident of fate and geography, is the easiest place one can imagine to reach by sea from the latitude of Sao Tome. And so you can get from Sao Tome by sea to Brazil really quickly by sail. And so the Brazilians established this communication between the Portuguese between Sao Tome and Brazil. And in the blink of an eye, the plantation model of growing sugar using African slaves crosses the Atlantic from little Sao Tome, where already fabulous amounts of wealth had been made, to enormous Brazil, where within the next half century, the sugar trade or the plantation business becomes firmly anchored and begins to revolutionize further the economies of Southern Europe. In less than a century, Portugal was making more money from sugar than it had made from gold in Africa. And Portugal already, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, in Elmina controlled more than a tenth of the entire world's gold supply. So if so quickly sugar could be worth more than gold, that gives you, for them, it gives you an idea of the value that they derive from exploiting Africans in the role of slaves on sugar plantations, first in Sao Tome, but then in Brazil on a much larger scale. So I don't want to make this answer too long, but to sort of, just to complete the thought, other Europeans, at each stage of these events, Europeans are watching each other, coveting the successes of each other and trying to horn their way in on whatever was working for their rivals and neighbors. And so the English and the French are watching the Portuguese success in Brazil and the Spanish success in Mexico. Especially Spanish were involved in extractive mining, selling gold and silver, also supported by slave labor. And the Portuguese are making money in sugar in Brazil. The Spanish and the French, so far left out of the action, are saying we need to get into this slave game as well. And because the Spanish had controlled the big islands of the Caribbean, but had sort of more or less left unpoliced and neglected the small islands, the so-called Lesser Antilles, that stretched toward South America and the southern part of the Caribbean, the British and the French start establishing outposts on these neglected smaller islands. And in Barbados, the British copy the Portuguese recipe for the slave plantation and set up a slave plantation society on Barbados for the growing and production of sugar. And this takes place in the 1630s. And again, within the space of about a half of a century, Britain is making more money on Barbados than from anything else in the world. More trade in sugar, more value from trade in sugar in Barbados than Britain is deriving from any kind of trade or business that it has anywhere else in the world. So our story, again, the normal narrative is it's all about Asia. The Europeans were trying to get to Asia. And by the way, I spent a lot of my career in Asia. I'm not castigating Asia or trying to diminish its role in world history, but I'm restoring Africa to the place where it belongs in this narrative. And it's been entirely cut out of the story as I've been telling it to you. So Barbados takes off and introduces enormous wealth into British society and starts changing culture in British society. Sugar is not the only thing that's being grown, though. Tobacco and coffee and cocoa are being grown, all planted and harvested by slaves. And so these products begin to work their effects on first English society. I said British. It's not Britain yet. It's still England. Through English society in the 1630s. I'm sorry, in 1650, I think it is, the first coffee shop opens up in Oxford. And then very quickly, coffee shops proliferate in London. The coffee comes from the Caribbean. It's grown by slaves in the Caribbean. And to make coffee palatable, you have most people back then, and probably most people even today, still think you need to put sugar in it. And so you have these two slave products which are behind the invention of the coffee shop and of the coffee experience. And coffee shops begin to proliferate in London and other parts of England, and enormous changes work their way through English society as a result of this. Some clever fellows seeing that for the first time in history, you have sober people congregating around drink. In other words, drink was always about getting drunk in the past. Now you have sober people drinking, not only sober, but drinking stimulants, which arouses their attention and intelligence. And the clever people said, if we gave them a bulletin about current events and sold it to them, that'd be a pretty good business. This is the birth of the newspaper industry. So the newspaper industry grows out of the coffee shop industry, and the coffee shop industry goes out of the slave business and the plantation business, the sugar business. And this is the sort of, I go into this in great depth in the book, but this is the beginning of a civil society in England, the birth really of manifestations of democratic life in England. And the way the story is told, we hear about the Magna Carta, we hear about the Glorious Revolution. We don't talk about how the exploitation and labor of people taken from Africa are what provided the material comforts and the stimuli that made these changes in English society, which were so pivotal to Western civilization, possible in the first place.
Yeah, thank you so much, Howard. Reading this book, I got lost in the story and the details, the places, the people. I literally traveled through time, meeting people, and the information was presented in such an apt storytelling style. And I'm wondering, how did you arrive at that style? It's not textbooky at all. This is very much a story, with many parts. How were you able to arrive at this storytelling style that you bring to bear in the book?
Well, first of all, I have to say how delighted I am to hear that. I have had very few conversations with the readers of the book so far because the book hasn't been published. This book talk will probably come out to the public after the book is in the marketplace, but so far only a very, very small number of people have read the book. And so it's really a delight to me to hear, and a source of great fulfillment for me to hear that you had that kind of experience reading the book. The first answer is, I guess, that I don't come out of a scholarly background. I've taught at a great university now for more than a decade, so I am a professor, but I come out of a tradition of journalism, and that's what, in fact, I teach. And so I've made my living for most of my life by finding ways of conveying information narratively and organizing information narratively in a way that the public will find accessible and hopefully compelling. And so that was a priority in terms of the organizational strategy and the narrative style of the book. I have to say, however, that I was not without some concern as I was writing this, because as I think I've gotten from your response to the book, this is 600 years of history, and this is a deeply documented book. This is not something I'm sort of in my armchair trying to figure out. I spent a great deal of time researching this book. The bibliography of this book is enormous. I think the footnotes are more than 50 pages long. The sheer number of places and of people and of facts in the book is, when I go back to look at it, sometimes I'm taken aback a little bit. And so I worried constantly as I was writing this, is it possible to keep bringing the reader along here? Is it possible to include as much information as I feel is important to include and not lose people? And of course, every reader will have his or her own individual experience, but I had to make design choices, so to speak, in doing this. One design choice right up front is slavery is, first of all, a tragedy, a human tragedy. There are few human tragedies that are more absolute than the tragedy of taking someone out of their home and subjecting them to chattel slavery. That is about, that's just about as bad as it can get. I could have told a book that went on at length in an emotional register about the nature of slavery and the meaning in the individual lives of people who were caught up in slavery and what is the moral lesson of slavery. I decided not to do that. And I didn't do that not because I don't think that those are truly important things for us to contemplate and consider. I didn't feel that I should try to cram any more books into the one book that I wrote than I had already crammed. And as I said, I have 6 centuries of history shifting from one continent to another. The geographic focus of the book, as you know, Joseph, changes frequently over time to totally different areas with totally different histories. Even within Africa, the history of, for example, the area of Ghana versus Benin versus Congo, these are totally different histories. To Brazil, to the Caribbean, to Britain, to Haiti, to in specific, to then the development of the United States, which slavery just became, an extraordinarily foundational experience. I felt like I had to create an integral whole, a story that captured the entire span of this, but that I had to walk a fine line between indulging, other techniques of storytelling that could be even more highly personal or more deliberately emotional versus relatively straight and narrow account of what actually happened.
Yeah. For me, my experience with this book is the profound effect of almost seeing that missing piece being restored. It is what it is. You talked about the existence of forms of slavery, even among these African societies. You talked about how the Benin Kingdom made the decision to stop selling slaves to the Portuguese. But I'll read you a comment by a reviewer from Publishers Weekly, and I'm interested in hearing your response to that. And the reviewer said that though Professor French elucidates much neglected history in this book, his claim that without slave labor, Europe might have remained a geographic and civilizational dead end, lagging eternally behind Asia and the Islamic world, goes too far, and he doesn't fully explain why Western industries and societies kept flourishing even after slavery's demise.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity. Most readers won't see a comment like that, but I'm happy to respond to it. First of all, so prior to the 15th century, I think it's an objective fact that there was nothing particularly distinguished about Western Europe in terms of its wealth compared to certain other parts of the world, India and China in particular. That Western Europe was not a leader in wealth, in science, in technology, in anything. And so in order to understand the writer's question on its own terms, one has to ask, so when did Western Europe become a leader or begin to become a leader? And it turns out that Western Europe begins to become a leader precisely at the moment that it begins to harness the wealth and the labor of Africa and of Africans. That there is no wiggle room there. It's precisely at that moment that Western Europe begins to emerge from its relatively undistinguished past in terms of achievement and begin to elevate itself and ultimately distance itself in wealth and power from the parts of the world, namely India, China, and also the Arab world. This is inextricably linked in terms of chronology. So you have to ask yourself as a first question, which I don't think this person asked himself, is that a coincidence or not? Economists and political scientists at MIT, who I cite, wrote a study of what they call the Atlantic effect. And they show that the wealth in Europe, starting in the 15th century up until the present, can be directly correlated to the degree to which countries were Atlantic world focused and therefore by association involved in the slave trade and in colonization. So the wealthiest parts of Europe are places that are Atlantic facing and that had some participation, direct or indirect, in wealth creation through slavery. Second piece of the man's question. I have the premise in my statement that Europe would have not risen or have not separated itself in wealth and power from other parts of the world. My working premise here is that this thing we're calling the West is Europe plus the New World. In other words, Europe conquered the New World, put Africans to work as free labor on their behalf in the New World, exploiting their sweat and blood for productive purposes. And at the same time, appropriated or expropriated the vast land and mineral resources of the New World. And so these two things come online for Europe. African labor in billions of man hours and natural wealth in terms of land and resources in the Americas. Neither of those things formed any part of what was the West, if we could speak of the existence of a West, prior to the 15th century. The West was Western Europe. That was the limit. Beyond Western Europe, there was the Atlantic Ocean, and no Western Europeans knew anything about how to get beyond the coastal waters of the Atlantic Ocean. And so the premise of my assertion is that Europeans would have been undistinguished had they not invented the West. And the West was Europe plus this conquered area of the New World where Africans were put to work in chains. Okay, final part of his question, he says, how can you prove that Western industrialization and other sorts of wealth-producing activities wouldn't have continued even had there not been slavery? I can't prove that. There was slavery. You can't ask me to prove something that didn't happen, right? However, what I will say is, more directly in answer to his question, so think about this as a track event. We're at some Olympic race competition, right? And so because the Europeans had expropriated the land of the New World and expropriated the labor of millions of Africans, it's as if they got a head start in the race. So the Europeans start running. It's a 1 mile race. They're already 800 meters down the course. Boom, there goes the gun. The rest of the world can start running now. It's only now, or actually it was only in the latter part of the 20th century that Japan, the first part of the world that begins to challenge Western Europe and the United States in terms of per capita wealth or industrialization, Japan begins to catch up. And then subsequently, South Korea begins to catch up. And then various other places, Taiwan and Singapore, begin to catch up. And now China, a gigantic entity, is well on its way to catching up, right? These were belated effects of catch-up because the United States and Europe, what I'm calling the West, these are integrated territories economically and culturally that both benefited from this expropriation, on the one hand of land, on the other hand of labor. They had this great head start. So I'm not saying that Westerners, once they had the great head start, can't keep doing great things. Of course, the United States is a society of great wealth and power and prosperity today, and probably there hasn't been slavery for a long time, and will probably continue to be wealthy, for some time to come, if not indefinitely, right? But it seems to me like a misconceived question to ask, how come they can be rich if there's no slavery? I didn't say slavery was the only basis of their wealth. I said slavery and the expropriation of immense territories in the Americas were the basis of their takeoff, which distanced them from other parts of the world.
This book leaves me thinking a lot about historical erasure. You did mention at some point in the book that the most important site of this erasure by far has been in the minds of the rich world. I'd like to understand why you feel that's the most important site of the historical erasure, specifically of Africa's contribution to the modern world as we know it.
I don't think that any Europeans in the 15th century or the 16th century were confused about the importance of Africa. I think that once Mansa Musa appeared on the Catalan Atlas, the map that's on the cover of my book, and that the Portuguese set out to try to discover how to access the wealth that Mansa Musa controlled. And the Spanish followed in their footsteps and tried to take this African trade away from the Portuguese. And then since they couldn't, since they were defeated at sea off of the West African coast, the Spanish began to prospect elsewhere for similar kinds of wealth. I don't think any Europeans were confused in the 15th century or the 16th century about the importance to Africa in their own historical lives or economic lives. I think the confusion happens later, the erasure, to resume or to repeat the word that you're citing from my book. It happens later, and erasure becomes important because Europeans trafficked millions of human beings from one part of the world across an ocean to another part of the world to work them on conditions that explicitly involved, in other words, this was part of the plan, working them to death. In other words, we're going to work you until there's nothing left of you. And then you're on your own, and we'll bring in new people to replace you. This was the whole proposition for hundreds of years. Okay, this is the labor piece of the Europe takeoff, right? And so because this is such a horrible thing, and because it had such a horrible impact on Africa even to the present, I think it became important to the European conscience to begin to erase Africa from the story. What happened with Africa was so horrible that if you include it in the normal narratives, you can't feel good about yourself anymore. It becomes difficult to attribute your success to your own qualities. And so the way Europeans, or Westerners in general, tend to explain their success in the modern era, meaning the last 500-600 years, is by speaking about cultural attributes, which they, until recently, have almost unquestioningly promoted as being special. So we have the Protestant work ethic, we have the scientific method, we have thrift, we have democratic values, we have on and on, right? Judeo-Christian belief system. The Westerners have clung to storylines like this to explain what happened to them. Not so much because they do in fact satisfy our need to understand, but because they help obscure the horror that accompanied what really happened, right? And so you can't really keep Africa in the picture. As you know from reading the book, I've said to the audience here already, I didn't set out to write an emotional book. This is not a book that's drenching in emotion. That was not my point. I wasn't pulling on those strings, right? But you can't know this history and feel the same about your successes as a Westerner as you did before, because it becomes clear to you, if you have an open mind and you're willing to follow the logic of the facts, that how you elevated yourself depended on true, systematic, deliberate, and extended horrors of one kind after another over a period of centuries, and that these were not a matter of happenstance or coincidence, but they were a matter of strategy, and they were understood at the time.
You mentioned that you can't know this history as a European and feel good about yourself, but then you also can't know this history as an African and come to terms with these details and feel good about how this has played out and where Africa is in the scheme of things now. What would you say about the importance of this restoration project, that I would call this book, so to speak, for the African mind?
First, on the European thing, I may have misspoken if I did in fact say Europeans can't feel good about themselves. I don't think that's altogether true. I don't think, all human history involves horror.
Yeah.
The special thing about the Western story is the way the horror was written out of the story. The way that Africa, which is the focus obviously of my book, has been explicitly and deliberately and so concertedly written out of the story, right? And so what I really am trying to say is that a European cannot feel smug about the traditional ways that he or she has been taught or has convinced herself that made Europe a special place. When you follow the facts, and you do so with an open mind, it's impossible to accept such easy old storylines about we had this or that cultural advantage, and therefore that's why we emerged faster, bigger, and better than the Chinese or the Japanese or the Indians or the who have you, right? The real reason is because at a particular moment in time, you struck upon a formulation of expropriation which ultimately came to inform or to employ enormous violence. And this was the very basis of your takeoff. Okay. So on the African side of the ledger, I guess the big lesson for me is that the key to European dominance of Africa from the very beginning was the fact that Africans, let's go back to the beginning. So these first encounters with Europeans, 15th century, 16th century, even the 17th century, the Europeans are trading by the 17th century enormous numbers of slaves in Central Africa and again in Eastern Nigeria by that time. Africans at that time did not have a sense of being African. There was no such thing as African for the Africans. You were of your ethnic group. You knew a certain number of ethnic groups in the relative close proximity of your ethnic group. And anyone who lived outside of that circle for you was just a foreigner. They happened to be black, but that was not anything of particular importance to you. There was no notion that there was something called a continent of Africa, or that there was something called white people whose project was to take over all of the productive labor potential of Africa and put it to their own use in the so-called New World. No African had any sense of that at the time. And so this made it easy for Europeans to introduce and to extend the trade in slaves with African societies. I'm not trying to tell you an easy, fun story that lets us all feel guilt-free about Africa's role in the slave trade. Like, I have profound questions in my mind every day about how it is, and I get into this again at some length in the book, how it is that Africans permitted themselves to sell other Africans to white people, right? But the fact is that very few Africans knew what the white people were doing with these people, and the Africans were almost never selling their own people to the white people. They were selling other people to the white people, people who, from their perspective, were either direct enemies, meaning societies they were at war with, or just aliens, people who, yes, they have black skin, but we don't know anything about them. They're not related to us. Their language is nothing like ours. Their values and religious systems and whatever not, they're totally different from ours. So there's not a synthetic sense of we're Africans and they're Europeans, and this is a project that's aimed to drain our continent of its young people to put to work on their behalf in the New World. Okay, so that's the first piece of an answer. Second piece of an answer, bringing us to the modern time, to now, is the only way that the African world gets out of or rebounds from this 600 years of horror is by understanding, in fact, that there is something called Africans. That Africa is not Nigeria, or it's not the Yoruba, or it's not the Wolof in Senegal, or it's not the Baule in Ivory Coast, or it's not the Fon in Benin, or it's not the what have you in this or that society. That there is, in fact, something. The world created something real called Africa. And that this real thing called Africa is, in the first and most obvious instance, the continent of Africa. But it is also, in the second instance, and this is maybe the most important and the most widely overlooked piece of this puzzle, it is, in the second instance, this huge diaspora that Africa has generated, mostly involuntarily, but in recent times, partly voluntarily. People who have left Africa or have been taken from Africa and have gone and established themselves in other parts of the world. Africans need to understand each other much more deeply for what they have in common than they have at any other time in the past. Africans need to reconnect somehow with Americans. I don't mean United States of America Americans. I mean throughout the Americas. And people of black ancestry in the Americas need to reconnect in much more profound ways than they ever have with the peoples of Africa. And it's in this rebonding, in this celebration of a common heritage, it's in these connections of culture, of learning, of business, of science, of ambition, that Africans can offer, Africans, and I mean this broadly, all of the people of Africa and its diaspora, can give themselves the best opportunity in a mean world to promote their own well-being. And the world is set up in a way that tries to make that very difficult. Americans of African extraction, like myself, are traditionally taught almost nothing about Africa. For most of the 20th century, Black Americans were taught passively or actively to be ashamed of Africa or to shun Africa. West Africans, or Africans in general, I think, fed all kinds of notions about what African America is like and are easily induced into thinking, looking down their noses toward people of the diaspora and saying, yeah, they're not really like us. They're this strange other. We don't understand their problems. They're whatever. We can't really get too close to them or associate with them very deeply. These are handicaps that we are imposing upon ourselves that have real costs and that will carry forward indefinitely in time unless we can find a way to address them. You don't find Chinese people behaving this way. China has a vast diaspora, and Chinese people in the diaspora think of their homeland, even 3 or 5 generations after they've left it, as their homeland. You don't find this among Italians who are in this country for 3-5 generations also, who still think of Italy as their homeland and who still celebrate the bond that makes them a people. Africans, broadly speaking, of Africa and of the diaspora are far, far behind in that sense. And so my book is written in that spirit as well, to try to incite people to look beyond their petty identities and to think much more boldly and imaginatively about what it means to be an African.
Thank you so much, Professor French. That's an excellent note for us to wrap up this book chat and have a fantastic rest of the festival.
It's been a great opportunity, great pleasure to speak with you, Joseph.
That 5 minutes madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.